Hello, and welcome to Temple of the False Pod, where our decks, they're not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
Forgot my name. We come to you every week with discussions about casual formats of Magic. We talk about Commander, EDH, whatever you want to call it. And tonight we are here to discuss the simple the simple topic of new mechanics. I say that kind of tongue-in-cheekly because new mechanics are never a simple task. And we're here to discuss kind of the yin and yang that is the badness of new mechanics being introduced to an eternal format.
I wouldn't say badness.
You wouldn't say badness?
We're saying this is yin and yang. One man's crappy mechanic is another man's, golden shining star. It goes all over the place. It goes all over the place. As I'm sure everyone will come to see as we get a little more involved in the conversation.
Yeah. So we have a few examples for you tonight. In grander schemes, and we wanted to just kind of sit back, and I had the idea of how new mechanics being introduced to a meta, whether it's your play group or your local game store, your LGS, kind of can either be tedium or a bit swifter. But with that kind of comes the broadness of everyone's experience levels and how people kind of prefer to play. It kind of brought us around to wanting to more talk about things such as parasitic mechanics and broken or easier to break mechanics. So that's we'll start with our parasitic mechanics.
Parasitic mechanics.
Mechanics.
So, I'm an old Magic player, and I would argue that parasitic mechanics are something mostly from Magic's past. We still do see them, but Wizards is very aware of parasitic mechanics now, so we see them less and less.
What are they?
So I went and digging. I did some research for this podcast. I know. And Mark Rosewater's article from November the 6th, 2006 talked a little bit about parasitic mechanics. And they define it as...
2006? Man, that was like 3 years ago?
Something like that. R&D uses the term parasitic mechanic. It means that an idea is too self-contained. He goes on to say, we want players to be able to look at cards and imagine things they can do with them. Cards that are too parasitic say, no, just look at this tiny subset of cards. So a parasitic mechanic is a mechanic that tends to get better the more of it you include in your deck. One of the most obvious ones would be Infect.
Ah, yes.
Infect is an easy one. When I was first thinking about this, I was thinking about Soul Shift, which is another mechanic that I think is parasitic in that it gets so much better when you play several cards with Soul Shift. However, I think Infect is probably a more common group set of cards that everyone understands.
Yeah. Or even to the broad extent of like tribal mechanics.
Right.
Tribal mechanics are naturally parasitic.
Right. However, a lot of the tribal mechanics, they're parasitic, but you expect them to be opened up in the future. So, like you can say Elves' tribal theme is parasitic, but practically speaking, it's so massive. There are so many options. Realistically, it's more a way just to reduce your focus from 30,000 Magic cards that could go in your deck down to cards relating to elves. It's less parasitic and more helpful for you to help you bring your focus in when building a deck. But a card like Infect, there are examples where one card is enough. Triumph of the Hordes is probably the most common of these cards where you're essentially treating it as an overrun.
Yeah.
Give all your creatures Infect, swing, I bet you do 10 points of damage. Of course you do.
Because it gives them trample too, right?
Yeah, it gives them trample. I forget how much is it +1/+1 in trample, or +2/+2 in trample? And infect.
Yeah.
So realistically, it's taking somebody's life total from 40 to 10 and giving all of your creatures infect. That card by itself can work. But infect on creatures generally, it's just not nearly as effective. You want to have a lot of them to make it really work. Because, if I'm running Skithiryx by itself in a black and blue deck and I just throw Skithiryx in there, well, it's good, but wow, wouldn't it be so much better if there were way more creatures with infect in my deck? Because then I'm not relying completely on Skithiryx to do all of the damage needed to win with infect damage. And if I never think that it's going to get there, then realistically all it is it's a creature that blocks and deals its damage in -1/-1 counters, which is still good, but it just doesn't have that play. If our format was tiny, this would be fine. If we were only drawing from a card set of 1,000 cards and 200 plus of them had infect, well, then it wouldn't seem all that bad. It probably wouldn't seem all that good either. But we're not. We're drawing from a massive card set that's only growing faster and faster and faster, to the point now where infect creatures, for the most part, none of them are good enough to make your deck. The only way they ever make the deck is when you have a whole pile of them that you can put together. And in the end, that means your deck building is constrained to just those cards. Yeah, people can then tell me, no, that's not true. Here's this, here's this, here's this. I'm like, great. You're showing me all these extreme ways that you have built a very unique, one-of-a-kind kind of build. You're proving my point.
It's a very, if you have to build around a certain mechanic very nichely, it is probably because it's parasitic, right?
Well, exactly. I am relying on other cards with the same type. Another common example is splice onto arcane.
Oh, yes.
Okay, well, so the only way you can ever splice is onto an arcane card. Well, okay, but now I need arcane cards to make this card work. And if I only have 2 arcane cards in my deck, then it really doesn't matter. This is the difficulty with Parasitic Mechanics. They just get worse as your format gets bigger, as it goes on longer. So unfortunately, mechanics that are parasitic don't tend to do well. You can build it. There's likely only going to be 1 or 2 effective builds. And I'm sure that Mr. Infect, Craig Blanchett, would say, that's not true. But again, you're building from a tiny subset of cards and trying to build out from there. It is parasitic.
Yeah, so I guess with Parasitic Mechanics, it's always tough because it has a clear follow-through. There are very clear ways to build decks. I'm thinking mostly, tribal type decks tend to be parasitic.
Right.
But in that, it generally closes the gap on creativity, unless you really want to dig into it, and then you've got those niche builds.
Right. Well, think about infect. What are your options? You're building with a bunch of smaller, subpar creatures.
Right.
How do you make that deck work? You find ways to give all of your creatures a power toughness bonus, or at least a power bonus. Give me a handful of ways so that my creatures can get through unblocked.
Right.
There are certain things that you can do to make it happen.
Right. And then you've got
but that's
Traxa to just proliferate.
Well, right.
It has not only a clear build, but it has a clear play. You are looking for a very specific way to win the game the same way each time.
Right. Your kill cards are going to come in the same way over and over and over again, and it's just there is a limitation there. Now you can try and maximize that. You can try and include all of the various options to allow for variety in your play. You can focus on a different creature each time and try and do something different with them. Maybe you want to focus on no infect creatures in my deck, just ways to give creatures infect, and then try and build based on that. That's great, but in the end, practically speaking, this is a parasitic mechanic that really requires other cards to maximize its usefulness, to maximize its effectiveness. So,
right.
And when you're talking about a meta like Commander, like most open casual formats, a parasitic mechanic is generally not what you're looking to build around, because it's going to limit how you can do things. It'll make your deck at least somewhat predictable. So it just sort of goes from there. So
yeah, I guess yeah, exactly. It's not to say that you shouldn't, or that like this is a thing that you don't do when building a deck. It's just that's a thing to keep in mind, that it may just end up being extremely predictable, and honestly might bore you very quickly.
Simply put, parasitic mechanics don't work in a format that's constantly expanding. You get so many decks out of it and then you're done. That you're just not going to get more until something comes out that is somehow weirdly targeted at that particular mechanic, or makes it significantly different in some way.
Right.
It's just not in and of itself ever going to be more than that. So I'm not really a fan of parasitic mechanics in our format, just because it limits the creativity that you can put in your deck.
Kind of going side by side with parasitic mechanics are these ideas that some mechanics are easier to break than others, but with that it becomes ubiquitous in the format.
The other downside / benefit to having a format that is as wide open as this is every time you add in a new mechanic, you can then take that mechanic and try and apply it to every other mechanic that's already come. And a lot of Commander decks are built this way, with the idea of abusing a connection between two mechanics.
Right. So, like, obviously, most main set mechanics are made with limited and standard in mind.
Right.
Otherwise, we'd get, solely Commander mechanics that would fall extremely flat when seen through the lens of standard. And that would be boring as heck for the short-term rotation of things like standard. But the exciting thing with that, like you were saying, is that with Eternal formats, especially Commander, people are always looking at these new mechanics and seeing how they interact with mechanics that R&D probably wasn't thinking of how they would interact. Or if they were, they'd be like, it'll sort itself out. Because there's just the game ends up being so complex every time you add a new mechanic that it's impossible to search for every edge case to make sure that XYZ card is not broken if it interacts with this other one.
Right. I think one of the interactions we were discussing was the idea of
persist and spikes.
For those of you who don't know, there is no group of cards that have spike in the text. Spike is not a keyword mechanic. There were a group of creatures that were referred to as spike something, spike cannibals, spike feeders, spike drone, and essentially they were all, for the most part, they were 0/0 creatures that came into play with a number of +1/+1 counters on them, and they all had an ability that you could either pay something, or I think in some cases nothing, and move a +1/+1 counter from that creature onto another creature. Well, then you get persist, where if there are no -1/-1 counters on this creature, when it dies, it comes back into play with a -1/-1 counter on it. Great. And if you've got a spike around, then you simply take a +1/+1 counter from your spike, put it onto your other creature, they cancel out, now the creature has no -1/-1 counters on it. So the next time it dies and comes back again. So this is hardly an infinite loop. Usually it costs mana to do it, to take a +1 counter off of a spike and put it on another creature. And there's only so many +1/+1 counters on the spike to begin with. So this is not even particularly dangerous. But it's an interplay that is sort of interesting. It's something that you can look at and say, hey, this creature can get a lot better if I play with this creature, which is the whole point of the mechanics, is that you're then taking these two mechanics that were never meant to work together and putting them together to make them work. I mean, it's, essentially any mechanic that will let you put a +1/+1 counter on a persist creature is doing the same thing. I just picked spikes because they're far enough apart. I know that they were never intended to be played together, and I doubt that Wizards even considered spikes when they were making persist cards, because hey, who cares? This is not a mechanic that's gonna, blow up a format or anything. But it does allow for interactions. It does allow for a whole new area to consider for deck building, and it's a lot of fun. Now, I've described an interaction that is,
fine.
That is fine. Exactly, it's fine. But we can all picture a situation where you take those two mechanics and it goes over the top. It gets stupid, So
it usually comes along the lines of things being errated, to be simplified or expanded upon. I think the biggest offender in this case is honestly proliferate, and how it interacts with things. I mean, it interacts with almost everything. For example, when cumulative upkeep had started being a mechanic, it was just, you had to just keep track of how many turns it was up.
Yeah.
I may be wrong, but there wasn't really any counters, like physical counters involved.
No, there wasn't.
So when proliferate became more of a widely used mechanic, or even just like became a mechanic, it was never intended to interact with cumulative upkeep as it was,
right,
or as it is now. So you get interactions with Braid of Fire.
So now Braid of Fire, the cumulative upkeep, is add 1 red to your mana pool. Now, this is during your upkeep. So there's a lot of restrictions as to how you can actually use this red mana. But, I mean, come on. We can come up with ways to use mana on our upkeep. But
this card also came from a time from when mana burn was a thing. So it was a little bit more of a detriment to just have this continually growing.
There was always this sense that, sure, you want to be, you'll find ways to make this work, but just keep in mind, if you had, a way to dump the red into something, if somebody killed that and you lost that way to do it, well, it looks like you could be taking a lot of burn, because you can't cast a creature spell to use up the Braid of Fire's mana. Well, now bring in Proliferate. Well, Proliferate is just taking those age counters and adding more. So you're just getting the red mana ramped up that much faster. You're not waiting for each of your upkeeps. You're getting that extra counter on each of your upkeeps. It's a great way to have the interaction between two mechanics.
I guess why I say that Proliferate is, the most serious offender is that, like, there's counters on everything. And I doubt that when Proliferate was invented, is that the correct terminology, released into the wild by R&D, they never would have expected it to interact with so many things. I'm sure there's a large amount of them that they were like, yeah, this will be great, +1/+1 counters, -1/-1 counters, infect counters, I guess poison counters, sorry, loyalty counters, all basic evergreen, essentially at this point, counters that would be proliferated to the moon and back.
The thing with a mechanic like Proliferate is that there are so many options that it's hard to say that Wizards can accurately say that Proliferate is safe. It's not. I mean, adding a +1/+1 counter to each creature that has one is one thing. Adding another experience counter is quite another. Cause,
Forgot about experience, yes.
Right, because you can't get rid of those. Like, no one can.
Right.
Not yet. So you're going to add experience counters to make those particular creatures, those particular legendary creatures, even stronger, even more powerful, and you're going to make it happen even faster than they already were doing it. Experience counters are lousy, and all Proliferate does is it takes a bad experience and makes it worse with those cards. Now, I'm not going to say that then because of that they should never make Proliferate, because that's insane. But what it means is that as a deck builder, as somebody who's playing Commander, you have to think long and hard as to whether or not, if you're running a Commander with that uses experience counters, is it appropriate to be running Proliferate? How much fun is that going to be? And, at what point does it stop being fun and just being, a massive punishment?
Well, the other thing too is with like a lot of cards that have there are a lot of cards that have specific counters to their card.
Yeah.
For example, like any sagas have lore counters, and the reason that like they are made the way they are is so that you get an effect each turn, and it's spaced out and not just like bam all at once. Which, I mean, Proliferate kind of sidesteps that and is like, nope, you're just gonna go right on to the next step. Good job.
Right. So I get nervous when you're talking about an eternal format, much like Commander, and a mechanic like Proliferate, which affects so many other mechanics. This is, on one side you've got Parasitic, which makes it difficult to build, and then on the other side you've got this thing, which interacts with what seems like almost every mechanic. And, sure, many of them interacts in a minor way, but there are many that interacts in a significant way. And you can make things very, very miserable very quickly. And it really, a mechanic like Proliferate really requires a group with a strong Rule Zero portion in it to lay control over this, because Wizards just doesn't. Wizards doesn't, and they can't. Well, I don't. Maybe they can, but they certainly don't. They make no efforts to try and stop this. So you need to keep that in mind. And is Proliferate mixed with whatever other mechanic you're mixing with in your group? Okay, probably is, but maybe it's not. And it's just something that it's a mechanic that just goes way over. It interacts with so many different groups. I run very few cards that offer Proliferate. I have one deck that uses Proliferate, and honestly, it's a deck I haven't updated in years, mostly because...
What deck's that?
Vorel.
Oh.
But again, I'm running it in a Vorel deck. I mean, there are plenty of Simic creatures that could run this that could lead this deck far better than Vorel. Vorel has been outclassed many times over, but I continue to use Vorel as a way to keep control over what the deck does, because I don't want it going off the deep end. And the number of cards that I have in the deck that do Proliferate are limited, and it just generally is mostly focused on +1/+1 counters. And then the occasional counter that may show up during the course of a game on other people's battlefields. But
and that's not even to say that, like, I mean, I guess in the same exact but opposite way that we were talking about Parasitic Mechanics, that's not to say you shouldn't play Proliferate. I mean, if you want to play Proliferate, do it. Just be aware that, like, it is very easy for Proliferate to be oppressive. In the same way that Parasitic Mechanics are very easy to be... What was the word you said?
I'm missing it.
Predictable.
Okay.
unlike the end of that sentence.
Yeah.
But like, Proliferate has its time and place, and like there are some really, really good decks out there. There are a lot of really fun decks out there. But just be like you said, it kind of comes down to the rule zero of it all. That like you got to be aware of your meta. You've got to be aware of your own fun, but also the fun of everyone else's.
Yeah.
Play time. What am I saying?
You're saying that if you're going to build a Traxa, if you're going to build a Traxa Super Friends, you might want to keep an eye on your Proliferate mechanics and decide, at what point is this just becoming oppressive and not fun for the rest of the group? And when we're talking about an eternal format like this, mechanics like Proliferate only get better, much better, as the format continues. Wizards consistently puts out more and more cards that have counters, and I'm not even talking just +1/+1 counters. There are all sorts of counters and all variety of manner where Proliferate really does get a significant benefit or offer a significant benefit. So it's and that's a product of the size of our format, of an eternal format.
Oh yeah. Hold on, Bruce. We gotta take a break. Give some time for our sponsor, and we'll be right back. This episode of Temple of False Pod is brought to you by Ordrick's Keyword Soup Kitchen. You down on your luck? Your friends having more interesting things going on? Jealous? Well, we can help you get what they have. Audrick's Keyword Soup Kitchen. We're not like Phoebe, head of Sneak, where it's all about stealing. We want to give. You get haste. You get haste. You get flying. At Audrick's Keyword Soup Kitchen, get your First Strike Death Touch Trample on and beat face. Next to Rayami's Mechanic Shop, right down the center of the battlefield. And now, back to you. Alright. And now, what's a mechanic that you hope never comes back?
Ooh.
I'll go first.
Okay.
I wrote down Split Second because Cross and Grip, super maddening to play against. I can't. I don't like being told, no, you can't interact with this, which is funny because I have decks that do that. But or if you're gonna there's just it because it doesn't use the stack. It's just, yeah.
Right.
I hope Split Second never comes back.
I think my choice would be experience counters. I tend to, it's hard to pick a mechanic that I don't ever want to see coming back because they're the mechanics I don't tend to play and don't even think about.
Right.
So there's a good chance that there's one out there that I really hate and definitely don't want to see come back. I'm just not thinking of it right now. But the experience, the mechanic that involves experience counters in any way, shape, or form, I hate this. Again, this is another mechanic that you can't interact with. I think it's the lack of interaction is what I really don't like about the format. I'm with you when you talk about Split Second and the restrictions that it brings. That there's just it just says no.
Yeah,
that's we're done.
At least
we are done here.
Right. At least with any other, disenchant type card or naturalized type card, you have a chance to maybe say no back. Yeah.
I don't.
Nope.
No.
Bruce,
No.
this isn't
No. No.
like,
No,
that's the thing.
no, and that's why we hate Cross and Grip. That's why That's why split second cards are so miserable.
I mean, we generally pride ourselves on being somewhat positive people. With the other side of the corn. Other side of the corn.
That's
Other
more
side
corn.
of the coin. Yeah, other side of the corn. What mechanic do you want to see more of that you feel like might have just gotten the shaft and maybe played a little or underdeveloped?
It's interesting because I actually heard somebody else talking about just this sort of just this question recently. I wish I could place it, but I got two mechanics for you.
Okay.
Goad and Monarch. I want to see more of both. I think there are with Monarch. I want to see more creatures. When it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. I want to see, when this creature does I want to have a creature that says tap, do a point of damage to target opponent. When the target opponent is the Monarch, you become the Monarch. I love that.
Yeah, no. I mean, it sounds like you want Conspiracy 3, Bruce.
I do. And I also want I don't want just that, but I also want cards that say if you are the Monarch,
right, get more
on your
value out of
on your upkeep. If you are the Monarch, destroy target artifact an opponent controls. Or if you are the Monarch, target creature you control gets plus. The smallest creature you control gets a +1/+1 counter. Or just you can add other benefits, and you can even theme them to the idea that you are the Monarch. So what would a Monarch get? Hey, on your upkeep, if you are the Monarch, each opponent must tap one land, and you get a treasure for each land that has been tapped.
Yeah.
I'm like, this is just, there are all kinds of weird and interesting things that go with Monarch that I would love to see.
Yeah. Which, we saw, a lot of in Commander Legends. You and I have yet to really dig deep into it, but it's also the end of January. It's...
Yeah.
To date this podcast a bit.
Yeah.
But, you're thinking of things like the cycle of courts.
Yes.
Where it's at the beginning of your upkeep,
yes.
XYZ. If you're the Monarch, better things.
Yes.
I just came across this card, I think, for the very first time. Archon of Coronation. When it enters, you become the Monarch. It's a 5/5 flying, blah, blah, blah. As long as you're the Monarch, damage doesn't cause you to lose life, which is weird. But having value out of being the Monarch more than just drawing that extra card.
Right.
It just seems so cool.
Right. And you can also have it so that, if you are not the Monarch, get a benefit or get a negative. Either or.
Yeah.
So that there's more riding on it. So that sub game becomes even more important. Now, I do think there's a line that you don't want to cross. You don't want to turn this whole game into, who controls the Monarch. Because then you've got this then that turns into an archenemy field that I really don't like either. There's another mechanic I didn't care for. But
it's funny because I think what you're explaining to is turning Monarch into more of a parasitic mechanic.
Kind of.
Kind
I
of.
mean,
yeah.
I like the basic setup idea of the Monarch. The somebody gets an extra card draw. You can stop them from doing that by doing combat damage to them. It encourages players to do combat damage. I think as long as Wizards keeps creating cards that continue to encourage people to attack the Monarch or to just attack, that's a good thing. To me, that's a good thing.
I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think what keeps it out of being a parasitic mechanic is that on its own, like singular cards that give the Monarch are strong enough to be in a deck, regardless. Like, it's not
right. My Queen
solely reliant on being a Monarch deck.
Right. My Queen Marchesa deck. If that was the only card that gave the Monarch, it would work just fine. It doesn't, it's not as though it gets multitudes better if I add in more cards that make me the Monarch.
Yeah.
Because in theory, if I already am, I don't really want more cards that give me the Monarch, because then I'm paying for something I don't need to pay for. It means I'm, what is the name? The Knight of the Black Rose?
Thorn of the Black Rose?
Thorn of the Black Rose that makes me...
1/3 Death Touch?
Yes, makes me the Monarch?
Yeah.
Right. Do I want to play that card if I'm already the Monarch? I think... you can play it as a way to protect yourself to keep being the Monarch, or you can wait until you lose it and then get it back.
Yeah.
So
I think that, that's kind of where those cards lie, generally, is to get it back without having to do the combat.
Right.
But it's funny because the mechanic that I want to see more of, I don't have nearly as much to say about, but it's the Rakdos mechanic from Ravnica Allegiance Spectacle, which is like essentially like if you do damage to an opponent, you have a new cost for your spell. So it kind of comes with this cool design space that you can do combat damage, you can do non-combat damage. Generally, however, damage is done.
Yeah, it's just loss of life even.
It's just...
you could just do... any of the Orzhov abilities that, lose a life, gain a life kind of thing.
There's all this build space around it. Excuse me. For simple value to get out of it. I mean, like... There's plenty of cards that are like, oh, in your upkeep, do 1 damage to target player or whatever. That, like, bam, immediately before your first before your first main phase, you've already got it triggered, so you can easily pay those costs.
Right.
And I think, like, if they ever go back to that mechanic... Not that I necessarily want them to go back to Ravnica anytime soon, but if they go back to that mechanic, I would love it. It's just such a cool idea,
right?
Because it gives you idea, like you'll be randomly sitting there one day and be like, oh my god, this would trigger it, and then you go build it.
Right. Part of what I like about about Spectacle, and there's a number of mechanics that do this or that work in such a way that fit this. It encourages people to be better players, that's not fair. It incentivizes players to play in a way that they can then discover that that's the better way to play.
Yeah.
So, like for Spectacle, you can cast it for the Spectacle cost rather than its mana cost if an opponent lost life this turn. Well, if you're playing it on your turn, the most common way for an opponent to lose life is combat. So in other words, the Spectacle cards are saying, wait until your second main phase to play the card. And generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, that's the right time to play it. You don't want to play your Blade Juggler.
Right.
Why would you want to... You don't need to play that on your first main phase. And if you are playing it on your first main phase, then you want to think about why you're doing that. Maybe you just desperately need to draw a card before your combat step. Maybe that's why you're playing it. But generally speaking, it's better to play it after you've done combat. You want to save your mana until afterwards. Let your opponents wonder what you have in your hand. Don't give away everything before your combat step. Spectacle says, without saying that, says, maybe you ought to hold off until your second main phase, because it'll be cheaper then. And everybody sees that, understands that, and hopefully the newer player will see that, understand that, do it, and then recognize, oh man. Or they'll go through their combat step and say, oh wow, I can now play this instant on my combat step to mess with my opponents. And I couldn't have done that if I had played this card earlier. So I think Spectacle helps make newer players better players. And that's one of the reasons that I like this mechanic as well. So
yeah. Oh my god, Bruce, I could go on for hours about mechanics. And we may one day.
We may.
Do you have anything you want to wrap up our discussion of new mechanics with?
I think I want to bring the focus back to Rule 0. I think there are plenty of ways in an Eternal format like ours to abuse mechanics. Even innocent mechanics, parasitic mechanics, because you'll find something somewhere out there that allows you to do busted, broken things with these mechanics. Mm-hmm. And we all know this. I mean, the rules committee has said this before. I mean, this is a broken format. You're expected to police your own deck in such a way so that you're not completely abusing the format. This is all Rule 0, and every new mechanic that gets created has to fall under this lens. It just has to. You can't just assume that every new mechanic you can do, that anything that it could do is something you should do. Give it a thought. Think about how that's going to work and what's going to happen. And we'll hope that Wizards doesn't give us cards that require banning, and instead gives us cards that allow us to build new and exciting decks because of new mechanics and how they work with old mechanics, and that we'll all be responsible enough to understand when we've gone too far for our group.
Yeah,
that's all I got.
I kind of along the same lines. I mean, I think you summed it up perfectly. If there's like a mechanic that you want to build around, just do it. Our mantra here is that our decks aren't optimized, but like, I really take that to heart when I build decks. I mean, I built my Tesa deck around the Afterlife mechanic, which, I mean, it ended up evolving from there, but it was built around a very niche mechanic that shouldn't be seeing as much play in Eternal formats for good reasons. But I went out and I did it, and I think like it is always good to never discount something just because it's a weak mechanic, or if it's something you want to do, just do it.
Yeah.
But that's gonna do it for us this week here at the Temple of the False Pod, where our decks are not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. You can reach us at falsepodmtg@gmail.com if you want to email us. If you want to tweet at us, we're on Twitter at falsepodmtg. We are also on Instagram, the same handle, at falsepodmtg. So reach out to us, tell us what your favorite mechanic is, your least favorite mechanic, why we're giving too much leeway to proliferate. Just let us really have it. But we'll see you next time. We'll see you next week. For us here at the Temple. I am Andy.
I am Bruce.
And have a great night.
Bye.
Hey everyone, Andy here. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Temple of the False Pod. Just a few housekeeping things here at the end of the show. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, pretty much wherever you can find podcasts. Subscribe and give us a review. It really helps out the show. And it'll show us what you like about our podcast. Also, we've got a Twitter and an Instagram. Our handle is FalsePodMTG, all one word. So be sure to follow us. Feel free to reach out to us there or drop us an email at falsepodmtg@gmail.com and tell us your favorite magic-related story. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again to you and to Bruce. He's Mana Burned on Twitter, and I'm Andy Weekend on Twitter and Twitch. We're Temple of the False Pod, where our decks aren't optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. Have a great night, and may your fifth land be the temple.